Hi, Loren here. Let's talk about the creative use of a wide-angle lens. So let's start off with what is a wide-angle lens. Any lens with a focal length under 50 millimeters is considered wide-angle. So here we have a 16 to 35 millimeter zoom, a true wide-angle zoom. Many people use a wide angle in tight quarters when they can't get far enough away from the subject to get everything in the frame. That's okay, but it's not creative. Or doing selfies, which is why camera phones are so good at selfies. They have an extremely wide angle lens. But the creative use of a wide angle lens is to accentuate the foreground. Notice how much larger the sunflowers in the foreground look compared to the ones in the background. The wide angle lens does that. By making the foreground seem larger, you are accentuating it and making the subject really stand out. Using a wide angle lens can create a sense of depth, make things feel like they are farther away from you. And as the foreground becomes bigger, the background diminishes. It can give the feeling of grandeur, or make your subject stand out in what could otherwise be a visually confusing scene. The wide-angle lens helps to simplify and isolate your subject, which can have a very dramatic effect. Foregrounds become very important in a scene like this up in Acadia National Park. The wide-angle lens accentuates the foreground and pushes the background away, making your foreground become more dominant. This is shot with a 24 millimeter lens. Notice how much larger the first post looks and how the others get much smaller the farther they are away. But when shot with a 200 millimeter lens, the posts almost seem the same size and they seem closer together. To prove this point, I got lucky and was able to shoot one of America's top models. Okay, it's me. So here I am, photographed with a 24 millimeter lens. So pay attention to the distance between me and the shed in the background. And now we'll go to a 50 millimeter lens, and the shed gets closer. So the camera was moved back, so the supermodel stays about the same size, but the shed gets much bigger. So watch now as we go to a 200 millimeter lens. Watch what the shed does. It gets even closer. I'll run through those again. Try to keep your eyes off the model and watch the relationship between the foreground and the background. 24 millimeters, the shed seems far away. 50 millimeters, shed's getting closer. 200 millimeters, the shed is even closer. So out at Valley Forge, 24 millimeter. Notice how the cannon in the foreground is much bigger than the one in the background. I moved farther back, put on a 200 millimeter lens, used the same aperture and shutter speed, but the photos look vastly different. Again, 24 millimeter, the gravestone in the front is dominant. But with a 200 millimeter, they all get closer together and seem the same size. You can say vastly different things by using a wide angle lens. Watch what happens when I go from this shot with a 24 millimeter lens to a 200 millimeter lens, a telephoto. What lens you use is one of the most important creative decisions you can make. But a wide angle can create some problems. Using a wide angle creates distortion, especially when shooting something with straight lines and you're shooting it at an angle, like these buildings in New York. As I shoot up at an angle, the buildings look like they're distorted, like they're leaning in, which they are because of the wide angle lens. Sometimes that can work for you. Or other times it doesn't work so well. This is inside St. Patrick's Cathedral. And again, shooting up with a wide angle lens, everything looks like it's converging to the center. But to minimize that distortion, if you keep the camera on the same plane as the subject, it will work. In other words, don't tip the camera up. Try to keep it aimed directly at the subject. You'll see the distortion as you look through the camera. It can be a creative decision, so I try to shoot things both ways and decide later. This is under the George Washington Bridge, and I think the distortion really works. And it can work on other subjects too. It doesn't have to be buildings. The way you aim and the angle you shoot at can create patterns and accentuate them. I especially like what it does with clouds. You can really make them look big and dominant. And extreme wide angle can make clouds look like they're flowing. But watch that distortion with living things. It can make them look weird. Avoid using a wide angle and getting close to heads. It will make them look huge, like this horse in Iceland. His head is not twice the size of his body. And you need to be careful when using a polarizing filter and shooting the sky. Notice how part of the sky is darker. It looks very strange and extremely hard to fix in post-processing. It happens a lot, so be careful with that polarizer. Notice how the sky on the right side is much darker than that on the left. A wide angle will add perspective to a shot. It helps give the feeling of depth by making objects feel like they're fading off into the distance. Or when you're looking up with a wide angle, it's a great way to give a feeling of space. The closer you get to the subject with your wide angle, the better. I'm only a couple inches away from the wall in this shot. It really makes the foreground stand out. I love to get low with a wide angle lens. It creates a special feeling. Look how often it works for me, getting low using that wide angle lens. It really makes that foreground stand out, no matter what kind of shot you're shooting. And a wide angle lens will give you more depth of field than telephoto. So if you're looking to have the maximum depth of field, pull out a wide angle lens. So when you're out shooting, think about what the wide angle will do for you. Let it make things stand tall. And if people say they are afraid of the wide angle, beat them with a pillow. Happy shooting.